No. No. No, there is no future for this union in its current state. As we speak, the union is buckling, and that is because it is based on illogical and unfair structures. For example, I say this many times, but I want to say it to as many people as I can. In any UK-wide referendum, it doesn't matter if Wales votes 65% for something. Stranger still, it doesn't matter if Wales and Scotland and Northern Ireland all vote 65% each for something, because if England votes 3% the other way, just 3%, England gets that vote. And it's illogical for England to vote any other way. Why would they vote for something that they necessarily don't want, even if it's a thing that might seem like it might match up? Huge problems there. That's a structural fault. So, research presented by Sheffield Hallam University and the Tax Justice Network to the Westminster House of Commons in August this year has shown that London doesn't redistribute money around the UK. It extracts money from the UK's peripheries. It is, as Vaughan Roderick put it recently on BBC Radio Wales, if the UK is a machine for redistribution, it's a machine built by the wacky races. Why is it that within the power of Westminster, a parliament in a different country, to snap away the very existence of this place? Why are we letting it get even more dangerous if Henry VIII powers get given to the UK Prime Minister to do such a thing? It is simply illogical and unfair. It's inevitable that a system so unfair, so unjust, will buckle under the weight of its own contradictions. There are no easy routes to a better politics. The crises that we face are multiple and need to be addressed. But it's the position of Labour for Indie Wales that independence will help, because it will make structures clear. But make no mistake, we don't pretend that this is a game. Britain is, as Gary Young put it in The Guardian recently, run by a self-serving clique, or floppy-haired rich people from Eton. And they will happily exploit an economic periphery like Wales, unless we cut off their political power and change the structures, change the relationship. Until we have a fair and logical system fit for the 21st century, there is no future in this union. Diolch.
Brilliant. Well, diolch, Jess. It will be no surprise to learn that I disagree with quite a lot of that, but I want to outline some of the reasons why. I actually agree with Ben's point there that there is no future for the union in this current state. You know, the union at the moment, a lot of people consider it as either a compromise or a cause. You know, I was doing some research earlier this week and I was looking at everybody's favourite Conservative, David Melding's blog, and he argues that it is very much a choice between whether it's a compromise or a cause. My feeling is that the current trend towards independence is purely as a result of the unholy mess that is going on in Westminster surrounding the exiting from the European Union. I firmly believe in a strong future for Wales in the, inside the United Kingdom. It's my feeling that putting up walls divides us, and internationalism is what makes us stronger. So it's my firm belief that we will remain in a strong United Kingdom. But it's going to be really important that we learn one of the lessons from the most recent referendum on leaving the European Union. I voted Remain, like I'm sure a lot of people here did. But Remain lost because one key reason: we failed to articulate the passion and the positivity around staying within the union. We relied a lot on data and evidence. And it was actually Linton Crosby, who's not my favourite Conservative, but he made the point in the Cameron Years documentary a few weeks ago that when people are confronted with a decision between their head and their heart, they often choose to go with what's in their heart. So my message today is about appealing to unionists to start talking about what is in our hearts. I think there is a strong role for the Welsh Conservative Party here. It is perfectly possible to be both a unionist and a devolutionist. And that's what I consider myself to be. This place has not been in existence for more than 20 years, and it's only in recent years that there has been serious powers and this place has been able to flex its legislative muscle. And before we consider independence, I really want to see this place maximised and the potential of what we can do here fully explored. And I think that means taking some really difficult decisions. I think we have a surfeit of politicians here in Wales. We've got 22 local authorities. We've also got 40 members of parliament, and that hasn't changed in the 20 years that there has been devolution here in Wales. The bulk of the work is done here in Wales. So I would like to see us have a real conversation about who represents us. Should we reduce the size of local government and reduce the size of the amount of members of parliament in order to bring more members here to give them the opportunity to scrutinise the government? Because I think that is what Wales really needs. That will generate better public confidence in this place. So I firmly believe that, like Ben, we need change, we need reform, and there is a future for Wales inside a strong United Kingdom on that basis. Cheers.
Shana, let's go to you next. So a third person on the panel who thinks that the union as we know it, the time of the union as we know it is ending. I think Brexit, amongst many other reasons, Brexit has broken the union, and I think it's time that we start saying that the union is already broken. It's not in the process of breaking. What Brexit has done is uncover all of the cracks that have already existed for a long time. So I think if we just talk about it as already broken, let's not talk about putting it back together as exactly as it used to exist, or as we may know it to be. Let's use it as an opportunity to reimagine something completely different. My vision, my view, is that we should all push for Wales to become an independent country now, autonomous in its economy, in its constitution, and free from the shackles of Westminster, and I hope that Scotland and Northern Ireland would do the same. However, what I see is a reshaping of Britain. It's not a union, but it's a different way of imagining Britain. We would be a partnership of equals, and we'd coexist with each other differently. So is the union going to look the same way in 10 years? I hope not. And I think it'll just widen our possibilities here in Wales if we took this opportunity to think a little bit differently.
And finally, Hugh.
Right. First of all, I'm delighted to be invited here. I'm not normally asked to express my opinions on these sort of things. But as somebody who's travelled the journey from Westminster down here to the National Assembly, who is if you like, a ultra-strong devolutionist, believes in the principle of subsidiarity way beyond this place, actually, then you wouldn't be surprised if I welcome the opportunity to express an opinion. And some of it will overlap with what Welsh Government have said as well. I think it's fascinating at the moment. It's not only because of Brexit, because this was creaking already. The machine is creaking. If you don't see it, we do see it. Internally, within government, within the Assembly as a scrutineer, as a backbencher, I see the system creaking. The express view of Welsh Government for several years, as put forward in concrete proposals, I think very constructive proposals, is that it does need to be completely overhauled. It's not a minor tinkering, it's a major overhaul. So, as you will know, Welsh Government has put forward proposals that, for example, say, and I've been on the UK minister as well as for a short time a minister down here. The way it currently works, although Brexit is changing it slightly, is UK ministers will sit at JMC and the agenda will be decided by UK government. The UK minister, in effect, which I have been, is also the England minister who sets the agenda. The terms of debate are set by there, and what is decided at those JMCs, and this is just an example, but what is decided there is determined by the UK minister, stroke England minister, and so on. Now, we need this to be radically reformed. So things like actually putting forward a Council of Ministers, particularly now, if we do go through Brexit, okay, and I'm not expressing an opinion either way on this one, but if we do go through Brexit, and what we currently have of the EU Council of Ministers disappears, then surely to God, we've actually got to have the equivalent of a UK Council of Ministers, where when I sat there, and my opinion and my vote was as strong as the Germans, the French, the guy from Malta and everybody else, it has to be here, but it isn't. There's no parity. So we have to have a new Council of Ministers within the UK. And by the way, it's not only Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. If you look at, for example, London, the powers there in some areas, like policing, are more significant than we have in Wales. Andy Burnham in Manchester has some more powers than we have in Wales. He's a bigger population as well, by the way. But he has more powers. So we need to get to grips with this. Now, Welsh Government has put forward proposals on this. I do not think at the moment we have great traction because of the timing and the chaos that's currently going on within the Brexit debate up there, but we have to. And you mentioned David Meldin. I've loved preparing a little bit for this, because all I've done in preparing is reading what Jeremy Miles has said and what the First Minister has said at Labour conference and what Mark's paper is. Now, really interesting, he says at the end, of his idea of, and he's long been an advocate of this, a more federal state within the Union, but with much more parity, with much more say for the nations and the regions about what goes on. And he says at the end of the essay that he wrote, only a bold vision that combines unionist and nationalist principles in a new and federal active union could stand as a coherent alternative to the confederation of independent states that may be fast approaching. There are different visions of what could come from here on, and we should be openly discussing all of them, including whatever an independent Wales might be and what might look like. But I think the more likely one is, the more likely, if we're willing to manage the process for the good of the citizens of Wales, is a much more federal structure, not necessarily with an active union, but one that we actually agree. What are the mechanisms that give us greater parity and respect for decision-making in Wales? And that should include, by the way, trade issues, international agreements, all of that stuff. We should be at the top table determining it, not being told by a UK minister what we have to accept. Now, that's quite radical, but I think it's inevitable, because otherwise this system, which already has massive cracks in it, will fragment. So is there a future for the Union? Yes, but only if we're willing to grab the bull by the horns and make it happen.
Great. Well, thank you for all that. I thought all of those contributions were really, really interesting, and quite surprisingly, they all quite agree with each other as well, which is not quite where we're going for with this debate, but we'll go with it.
Well, I have a disagreement about federalism.
Well, you kick off with that disagreement then, Ben.
If that's helpful.
Yeah.
So the current active union bill put forward by Lord Hayne, Peter Hayne, has some interesting parts. The decision-making on a new body that would it would be called the UK Council of Fair Funding. So they'd be the people who look at what gets money from the central to the periphery. That would still be majority London/English ministers on that body. If you look at the bill, it's freely available online. And even though the votes might be parity, the numbers themselves are still weighted in England's favour. And of course, that's understandable in some ways, because there are a lot more people in England. But of course, that's going to affect decisions. We won't necessarily have as much say about what our money goes. So funding-wise, the federal thing's still really problematic. But when it comes to the actual, even if we got there and everybody in the UK said, yes, let's do it, there's a point in the bill which says, okay, we need to have a referendum to confirm it, a confirmatory referendum. Funnily enough, there's a 65% in there as well. Strangely, and I don't know why they've done this, but it says that there has to be an overall majority over the entirety of the UK, absolutely understandable, but Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland has to vote for it by 65%. Is that going to happen? This is the question. This is a huge problem. Why would they put that in there? It's tricky.
And that's why, Ben, I don't think we should accept what's currently on the table, what is within that bill. or other proposals. I think the idea behind a convention that would argue this through, because I bet, I can guarantee you that whether it's on funding or whether it's on parity on decision-making around major policy areas, it wouldn't just be us arguing for what's been termed the peripheries, because I think what I'm talking about is you turn this on its head. The peripheries cease to become peripheries. The peripheries actually become the ones who set the main agenda, and then we then tell the centre, we flip it on its head and tell the centre, this is what you do now for all of us. But Andy Burnham and the Mayor of London and everybody else would equally be arguing, and quite rightly, let's make sure that the right funding is going out to the regions and nations, and we'd have to argue within that. The other thing that we could do if we had a convention is talk about the rules of the game. So, for example, if you do have, whether it's through an act, which I don't think is wholly necessary necessarily, but if through a convention you agree to do it in a different way, if you look at the European scenario, you have powers of veto. So you have to get on certain key decisions on policy and funding 2/3 majority, or you even have situations where one vote, and I've done it myself, can say not acceptable because this will do Wales down. Now that's what we should be looking at, because if we're genuinely looking at a post-Brexit scenario, then give us at least the fair rules that we currently have within the European Union at a UK level. So I agree with you in the sense that I think some of the proposals at the moment are flawed, in which case let's get it out there, but it can't only be for the good of Wales, it has to be for the good of Birmingham and Teesside and London and everybody else as well. And I think we could get there if there was a will from the centre to actually get up and going, because at the moment the calls for this are only coming from us.
Does that veto, does that sound a lot like what Sinead was talking about you know, the ability for us to work as neighbours, equal partners? And could you say that there's a confederal federal system in the future that might be possible to, if we can get I mean, maybe Wales should just make a constitutional convention happen.
It's my personal position. It wouldn't be shared by everybody, but it's my personal position that would be the desirable outcome. The future of the union would be literally that you have that parity, not greater parity. You have that parity. You've got to have, as the Welsh Government have suggested, things like independent arbitration on key decisions and so on. But you would have parity. So it would no longer be the situation where you have top dog says what goes. You actually turn it around, so the top dogs are us and everybody else out there in all parts of the UK. And then we say to them, this is what we want to discuss. This is how we're going to agree it. That is a much more federal or confederal system.
I want to bring Sinead and Faye in here, because one of the things that's been already highlighted that I was going to ask about actually is the Constitutional Convention. ERS has long advocated that the future of union should be decided by a Constitutional Convention. It should absolutely be something that the people of the UK are brought into a conversation about and able to discuss and have an impact on. Obviously, the Brexit referendum has led to this kind of divide within the public, and I think there would be a need with any kind of reform to make sure that the public are brought along. Do you think a constitutional convention is the way of doing that? And do you want to start, Sinead?
Certainly. I think what can be difficult is oversimplifying, and that's what we found with Brexit, isn't it? It's sort of rhetoric repeated over and over again, and it's rhetoric that's been placed upon the public, which is easily parroted. So I think anything that any kind of conversation that can be brought from the public and brought from communities across Wales is going to be a good thing. I think also a constitutional convention will also help reflect the diversity of Wales. It's true that sort of here in the Assembly and in Westminster, it's not properly representative of the communities. You know, you can see that from the BAME percentage of our elected representatives, etc., and of women, of course. I think if there's a concerted effort to bring in true representatives of communities, I think that will create more answers that work better for Wales. So I think it'll be a really important listening tool and will provide, very important results.
How do you persuade elected, established politicians, including the UK government, to go down this path of reform. I think it's pretty obvious that this is what's needed in Wales. The Welsh government kind of back it now. I think Mark Drakeford's speech at conference recently really highlighted that. But Westminster just don't quite seem to get it yet. How do you bring them along too?
Yes, I think probably the new lows that we have sunk to over the last week in terms of our political discourse demonstrate that something has got to change. And I think we would all acknowledge that it's a very febrile government environment at the moment. You know, we know there's going to be an election. My money's on the fact that we'll have 2 elections in the next 12 months. I do think, you know, we are reaching a point now where we've crossed a line, and reform is going to be absolutely essential. And I really agree, Charlotte, with what you were saying around the need to take the public with us, because again, it's been so obvious this week that people have had enough, people are fed up, and you know, if we are going to make genuine change, I think we are going to need to have to take a much more constitutional approach, and that would bring people together, generating much more public confidence in what our politicians are doing and in what our lawyers are doing. You know, it pains me that the judiciary was under such pressure this week and negative public attention. So I think absolutely bringing everybody together is essential, and I really do hope, you know, that this week the one good thing that will come out of it is change.
Ben, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about how you envision an independent Wales. And one thing you said was about, I've got my notes there, structures being more clear and having a lot more clarity around structures in independent Wales. But I was just wondering how you kind of saw it developing, especially in light of the fact that it's kind of come out of a crisis. How do you then build something new and something fresh and something positive?
So that's a big question.
Sorry, I asked like 5 at a time.
How do I see an independent Wales? So I'd like things to be much more distributed. I'm quite radical in some ways, but I'm also moderate in other ways. I'm what you'd call an eco-socialist. I want a very sustainable future. But at the same time, of course, I feel, as someone from Powys, there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes felt by people not in Cardiff, especially the north. All my northern brothers out there. But yeah, I would like, you know, for example, a second house. I mean, Wales is really, I mean, it's interesting. I think I've got to disagree with you when you say we have too many politicians. You can look at Northern Ireland, or you can look at American states. American states have a crazy number of representatives, especially compared to Wales. And let's not forget, of course, that our MPs in Westminster can be completely ignored, you know, if they need to be, cofiwch Tryweryn, of course. So I want things to be distributed. I want things to be open. I mean, there's a lot to be said about open government, but the radicalism can come in how we educate and keep our democracy alive and changing and more open and more transparent and better, but also more across the country. When you go through Powys, you don't see the great institutions of state. You see some amazing views, and you see great farms, and you see great towns. But can we have a second house in Caersus, please? Or do we have it in Carnarvon? Can we put these things, because, you know, Maria Mazzucato, the economist, recently wrote that basically the whole point of a brilliant book was that governments make economies happen. America invested in IBM. IBM became one of the biggest computing companies in the world. The same for Apple. The same for Microsoft. Public money did this. So if we can distribute that public money by distributing the political institutions, then you have a fairer Wales all over.
Not much to disagree with there, surely.
No, but I'd like to add something, because, right, if I could be king for a day, a benign dictator, then what I would do is straight away set up the convention. The convention will do 2 things. One is we can do none of this. We are here, sitting here, the Great Ivory Tower elite discussing this once again, and it's important, by the way. Sorry, I say that because of the public discourse around this. That's what people look at us discussing this. You have to do a convention. That convention has to be more than the normal offenders. It actually has to be something around citizen engagement on a wage, and we can do this because we've got some good practice in Wales now, where you actually put in a digestible way stuff in front of people so that they can wrestle with the arguments over how we do these reforms and come to an informed decisions. Citizens are not stupid, but they don't live in the same world that we do. So somehow putting that information about reform. So that's what I would do first of all, is set this up. I would tell the UK government we just need to get on with this, and we need to do it across the UK and in all parts of the UK as well, including those regions and city regions I've talked about. The second thing I would do is I'd actually look at the convention beyond here. There is an issue here, by the way, and I know some people will say this is a stupid thing for anybody who's counting on votes to say, but we do need more people in this chamber. And the reason we need more people in this chamber is twofold. One is the issue of scrutiny, and I've been 15 years now a scrutineer. This is drastically underpowered in here. You do not have good government unless you have just the bare minimum number of people to scrutinise the government effectively and hold them to account. It is underpowered, because we've got so many people in ministerial positions or in doing other things that we don't have enough backbenchers with different views and different perspectives to really hold it to account. So we do. But you know, that convention could also look at, rather than a second chamber here, let's talk about the House of Lords. Let's put that in there. 800 members, life peers, hereditary peers still. Let's talk about bishops and whatever. Yeah. Let's talk about making it a second Senate of the nations and regions, where you deal with that issue then about the disparity of it predominantly being a southeast London thing, and you say we will make sure that Wales and different parts of Wales gets equal representation along with the northeast, the northwest, and so on and so forth, and you do it on that basis. So then we're into something that makes the union fit for purpose. So that's the reason why a convention is so useful. It's one, we need to do an exercise of engaging with, and if we feel important, persuading the public as well that these reforms need to be done. And why is it important? Well, when we get into the arcana of it, it's not to do with reform for reform's sake. It is ultimately because, even though we'd hold different positions on where the ultimate end, if there ever is an end of this, is, it's because it's to do with delivery of services, economic benefits, better housing, better schools, and so on and so forth, better share of funding. And at the moment, the system we have doesn't deliver on it. Now, how do we... you mentioned one other thing. How do we persuade the great and good in the Westminster end to do it? I think at the moment, because of where we are in Brexit lockdown, it's almost impossible. We had some good people recently who were sort of understanding devolution, people like David Liddington and so on. I say this without, without playing political hardball. I think the crisis that's currently going on up there, just to get through something, means that those discussions now are going nowhere. So common frameworks, how we do some of this stuff, it's sort of stalled. But let's just look a few months ahead. If there was a Westminster government that wanted to do this, then the people who should be knocking on number 10's door are Nicola Sturgeon, Mark Drakeford, Andy Burnham, and so on. So all of these people should be up there saying, united front, this is now not what we are politely requesting. We're demanding. We need a citizens' convention. We need a wider public discourse.
Right. I want to open up the discussion actually for any questions from the audience. I think we do have some roving microphones. Yeah, there's one there. Does anyone have any questions? Great, we've got one over there. We'll take a couple at a time, I think, and then come back.
Hi. It seems to me what you are talking about, those of you who aren't talking about complete independence, is constitutional reform of the UK. And that is the top-down thing at the minute. And you talk about there being an opportunity and it being broken. Yes, it's broken. It's been broken for years. I think as one of you mentioned, it's just the cracks are becoming more visible. And it hasn't fallen down yet. I'm nowhere near as confident as you that it will fall down. Because one of the most important bits of any constitution is the way it changes itself. Currently, that bit belongs to Parliament, and as long as we have a majority government, it belongs to the government of the day. Why on earth would they give that power up? So I'm not as confident as you guys that the pressure for change will result in anything. But so I think you need to think big. You need to think of a pussyfoot with words. Think a new constitution for the UK. Say it. That's what it is.
Great. Any other questions? Yep, one here.
Yeah, I had so first thing, like a request for clarification. There's been this talk of a constitutional convention keeps coming up. I wonder if people could speak to what what would that actually be? We're talking about going around different parts of Wales, but kind of what in the, what are we talking about? Lots of citizens' assemblies, or you're talking about blah, 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 like, what would that be? And then also kind of like a point of frustration that I guess is not only this frustration with like, Westminster and the UK English-dominated institutions, but I wonder if you could speak also to, frustrations with this place and the settlement we ended up with. And say, for instance, again, there's talk of, say, extra seats came up and Constitutional Convention came up. And my understanding is that, the Labour Party in this place, not to get too party political, but, voted those things down when Delis Duel put forward the convention and the extra seats as well. And, like, how do we overcome that? So.
And then there's one at the back there, and then we'll go back to the panel.
So I was considering that how do we bring this message out to, like, how the general public? Because already there is a massive problem of a lack of awareness or interest or engagement within politics, and specifically, especially within Welsh politics. Like, if we are struggling already to engage people with politics within the Assembly, how do we get them to start speaking about independence or federalism at all?
Who wants to kick off with any of those?
Look, the reality is, I think that for a lot of people out there, even now, this doesn't tick their box as the most important thing going on. So there's a real onus on us then to go out and actively do this. And I think that's where the idea... I'm not quite sure what the convention would look like, but I think we need to think hard about it. But it should certainly involve actively engaging citizens and put in the right balanced information in front of them about the obstacles we currently have, the strains we currently have, and potential ways of resolving it with genuinely an open mind. Because I think then that would actually get the feedback from the citizen. You asked the point about Labour Party and so on, and it's absolutely true, just like devolution, this is an evolving thing within the Labour Party. The way we take this forward here, in terms of reform here, additional members, electoral reform, which I'm supportive of, by the way, is last week we took through a bill here. Ellen spoke to it actually from a presiding officer commission point of view as well. But a bill went forward actually establishing a time-limited, I think it's about 6 months, 7 months committee on electoral reform. It's to do with the phase 2 stuff. So the phase 2 is the difficult stuff that was parked. It was additional members, electoral reform. And Dawn Bowden has been put as chair of that, Labour chair of that committee, but it'll be made up of all parties. A couple of parties have said they don't want to take part in that, which I hope they reconsider on, particularly our Conservative colleagues, because even if they disagree with it, I think they need to be in there as part of this discussion, wrestling with the arguments and then perhaps objecting to it. I don't know. But not to be part of this committee, I think, undermines it. Internally in the Labour Party, there is a dialogue going on as well, because there's a wide range of opinions on, one, the political difficulty, and we're not alone in this. It's in at least the Conservatives as well. Difficulties over politically selling this message. I'm not afraid to sell it because I can see the reality of the dangers of not doing electoral reform here. But a lot of colleagues will look at it and say, crikey, with everything that's going on, not just Brexit, but pressures on public services and so on, we really want to talk about this. But that's the way forward. The committee that was set up last week of the whole House, and secondly, internal Labour Party dialogue, and I hope there's similar internal Conservative dialogue that will lead to them being part of this formal committee as well. That'll report back in about 6 months. Let's see what it comes up with. Wouldn't it be interesting if it did come up with a majority view that said, yeah, we need to bite the bullet?
Sinead, I want to come to you next on that first question about why would a government give up power. So how does Plaid envision changing the UK government's mind? How do they imagine forging ahead with independence?
Yes, I thought your question was a really important point. This is why I think that federalism doesn't go far enough, because there is always going to be a tipping scale that points towards London with this, and yes, it just means a bit of a reshuffling of the Barnett formula, but I don't believe that the powers that are held in London have the vision or have the imagination to be able to be able to sort of present those powers to Wales. So I think it's going to be one of those things where we have to decide for ourselves. So in terms of Plaid Cymru's policy or Plaid Cymru's way of thinking about it, it's exactly why we would want independence, is because the clout of Wales versus the clout of Westminster will never be enough. And like Ben was pointing out at the beginning, even with the whole of the nations outside of London, we'll never be able to progress things in a way that if it causes friction with the status quo in Westminster. So I think that's the biggest argument for independence, really, for me.
Can I just pick up on a point that you made that I thought was really interesting, where you talked about English-dominated institutions, and we've spent the last 40 minutes talking about this place and Westminster, but we have another institution in our media that I think needs fundamental, I don't know if reform is the right word, that implies legislation, I don't mean that, but that needs a massive shake-up, because we have a huge problem with the media in Wales. I don't think it is anywhere near strong enough. I don't think it provides the sort of robust criticism that we need of both Cardiff Bay and Westminster. So I really would like to know what we can do about that. You know, we had the flagship BBC political question time programme here, Question Time, on Thursday night in this building, and Wales was not mentioned once. I think that's disgraceful. And, you know, Adam Price was on that programme, he did his best, but we've got to find a way of having a conversation with the media that, you know, makes it clear that we are not just an add-on item at the end of a bulletin.
That point relates to that question of how do we put the message out. So how do we put the message about what Wales does, but also the future and the need for reform, if there is one, and what that reform does? How do we do that?
So there are a few ways, and Scotland's a really good example to look at. Scotland and the SNP, even before the referendum, had what is essentially a wider political education campaign. It wasn't specifically for the referendum, it was, this is what we could do, this is what we do now, this is what we have, this is what we could have, over and over again. In 4 years of campaigning before a referendum made people get involved. So I'm not saying we should set actually no, I am saying we should set a future date for a referendum on Wales' constitutional future for ourselves, and we should build up to it. And more than that, we should encourage, and by we, I'm not in the government obviously, but I'd love the government to encourage citizens' movements to do that as well at the same time. Loads of people want to do this stuff. You look at the all under one banner marches for independence. I spoke at the first one in Cardiff, and people were talking about different things, not just independence, they were talking about so many things all the time, and all of these people are just normal people, normal jobs, but they're really engaged. You can hitch your wagon to so many of those. And I know that a Lib Dem currently, Gwynor Jones, is setting up a sort of national conversation to make that happen, both online and off, and he's having small sort of meetings all over the country and wants to get as many people involved as want to be, to ask these questions on a personal, simple, human level, as well as the complex stuff. So we can set a date if we want, or we can encourage these grassroots educational movements.
Okay. Is there any more questions?
I'd like to ask a question.
Okay. If you just wait for the microphone for a second, because it's being broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a question rather than a comment. Do people think there's a case, if we're talking about changing the British Constitution, to include British territories which are not in the United Kingdom? We've already had, in effect, historically, the Isle of Man and the Channel Islands and Gibraltar as sort of de facto devolved governments before the bigger bits of the United Kingdom. We're going to have devolution. But we've got places like St Helena and Ascension Island and places around the world with relatively small... Well, the Falkland Islands, of course, is quite sizable. But I think there's a case of... I think we've been lucky so far. We haven't had problems by some relatively small country invading some of our overseas territories. And I'm not going to make the case now, I'm really asking a question, but I think we ought to look for the potential of the future, particularly of resources under the sea and fisheries, etc., whether we ought to be thinking wider than just literally United Kingdom, but British territories. Thank you.
And there was another question over here somewhere, wasn't there?
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks very much for a very thoughtful discussion. It's really interesting. I think the panel is right to say that Brexit has changed the terms of the debate, and the rules have changed to some extent. But the kind of conversation you're having is the kind of conversation we could have had 10 years ago, 15 years ago. And the Trump Brexit genie is out of the bottle. And it seems to me that a chattering classes kind of discussion, I'm a fully paid up member, I'm an honorary member, a life member of it. But unless these debates can be linked absolutely intrinsically to the economic prospects of our fellow citizens, it's worthless. I'm sorry to say that. And the Brexit referendum result in Wales has shown that. There's not just scepticism about institutions, there is an absolute contempt out there for our institutions. So I'd like to ask the panel how, in this debate, in your various perspectives, how you're going to get that traction with some of the poorest people in Western Europe in order to win arguments, not fancy discussions about what kind of voting system we need. It's got to help people's economic prospects, it seems to me. If you disagree, tell me.
Okay. Is there one more, and then we'll go back to that? Yeah, there's one at the back there, if that's okay.
Thank you. A constitutional convention is a very long-term project. What needs to be done in the short term to ensure that there is still a union of some form to move into a new constitutional settlement?
Great, some really interesting ones there. Who wants to kick off? Does anyone want to address the overseas territories issue?
Happily.
Okay.
I'm probably going to whiz through all three, if that's all right. I'm going to have to disagree with you, sir. I'm going to have to disagree with you. I think we should be in a process of decolonisation, not recolonisation. Any exploitation of the seabed is a bad idea. I'm sorry. We've got to think about the planet's future. Just a respectful disagreement there. And also, there are lots of places around the world where Britain has owned, that has a history that they no longer want to be attached to. The British Empire, you know, we have to move away from that. And that's just my perspective. How will we make people aware that a different Wales can be better for them economically, financially? We can make quite astute and clear models and comparisons. If Wales taxed like France, we'd be rich enough to be an independent member of the EU without the UK. But better, if we wanted to and be more radical to make people happier, we could emulate the happiest country in the world that has a similar population, Finland. Do you want your life to be more Scandinavian? Do you want it to be happier? Do you want it to be more community-based? We can do these things with those models. And on a what can we do in the immediate future to preserve the so-called union? It's not up to me, it's up to Westminster.
Sinead.
Yes, I'd like to answer your economic point as well. Adam Price has said that Brexit is the wrong answer to the right question, so it's clear that this form of democracy has allowed people to protest their, the things that are causing them distress and misfortune, and so I think it was a form of protest. But I think an answer to that, the right answer could be independence. So if you look at, again, modelling similar countries that have gained independence, Iceland, Ireland, Zimbabwe, all of their their prosperousness sort of shot up immediately after independence. So it's clear that gaining your own powers in such a way will benefit us, is my belief.
Okay.
In terms of how you present this so that people want to engage in it, whilst there are technical things that we've been talking about now, and I'll touch on a few of them now, what we could fix immediately, it all needs to be presented on what is the best outcome in terms of not just economic, but wider well-being as well. We're in a country where we pioneered with the Future Generation Well-being Act. What do we want to look at? Are we on incessant economic growth at all costs, or actually are we looking at better communities, more livable communities and so on? But that's where the argument needs to be framed. Why would we want to do this? It's because, one, currently it's not working, and we need to highlight why it isn't working and what that means in terms not simply of funding, but being dragged along on, if you like, a Southeast financial markets model, and what that means for manufacturing in Wales, what that means for valleys communities. It's not only Powys that feels distant, Bridgend and Garw Valley feels distant. So it all needs to be argued within that. But I think if we do it in the way that we've been discussing today, that we put the alternatives out there from full independence, and there are slight variations on what full independence looked like. Bear in mind, as is often said by Labour politicians, Keir Hardie was a home ruler. When you start wrapping underneath that, it's not quite clear that it's the full same independence that we're talking about. But from that to a more federal system, to whatever, what we are all agreed with on this panel, what Welsh Government agrees, that it's currently not working. So put why it's not working economically and socially, and why it doesn't fit with what we're trying to do in Wales, and then argue intelligently about the different options. I would have a very different take on what the evidence is saying about if we suddenly stepped over into independence would mean. But we can argue that out, and we can put that in front. What can currently be done if, in a few weeks' time, for whatever reason, or a couple of months, we have a UK government that is back at the table talking about how we reform common frameworks? There is a piece of work going on, by the way, at least it's on the table currently with Welsh Government, about reform of the JMCs to see whether we can move to a system where it is actually more parity of setting the agendas, agreeing. It's still there. It was being worked through up until very recently. We could actually fix some of these things now and get the intergovernmental machinery, which most people would say, what the hell is that? But the things that allow Mark Drakeford and his ministers to step up to the top table and say, this is what I want to discuss, and this is my red line for Wales, and have that discussion. Well, that was underway. We need to get back onto that. We could fix some of this already. Your point on overseas territories, finally. There is already a minister in the UK government, and this is where I think we genuinely have that discussion about what we say to the UK government is theirs. I think overseas territories is absolutely, even though we have an interest in things like Wales and Africa and so on, overseas territories, UK government. Curiously, and I'd agree with Ben, I hate to do this agreeing stuff, but the biggest thing that overseas territories give us is not exploitation of mineral resources or whatever, it's actually they are our biggest repository of biodiversity. If you want to look at where we get the gains and we start actually reversing biodiversity loss, it's the overseas territories. Now, that's where we shouldn't just have a UK minister, but in my reformed House of Lords when I am king for a day, and we shrink it to at least half the size of the House of Lords, we would have representatives in there that would represent the overseas territories as well, who talk about their indigenous populations and talk about the biodiversity and talk about the airport that one or two of them need and so on. But we put it in that second chamber, reformed, elected.
I do want to ask you about that economic question, how you get traction with the poorest communities in Wales.
Yeah, and that was something I particularly wanted to respond to Rob on, was, you know, I think it goes back to the point I was making earlier on around the media, because the problem with the Brexit referendum is that it was a binary choice or a binary question. It became a very polarised debate, and you're wrong and I'm right, and it became, you know, quickly very negative. And Project Fear was a label put on the Remain campaign for pointing out what would happen according to our best economic forecast. This is what would happen. This is what Brexit would cost. Now, I was a Remainer, but I never felt that that is negative or Project Fear. It's not negative to say, if you step out into the road, you are going to get hit by a bus. That is not negative. And I think we need to, you know, again, look at our media, look at the way in which our political conversations are reported and represented, and also treat the public with a lot more respect, I think. I think, you know, the public will very clearly understand that these things are complicated, and we don't need to boil it down to two sides of the question for the sake of balance. So I think, you know, looking at media, and to your point at the back, I think I'm probably going to say the most unpopular thing I could say, which is the one thing that I think will help us make progress towards constitutional reform and build more public confidence in this place, is getting on with Brexit, get it done with a deal in a positive, prosperous way, where, you know, we might end up with a referendum or a general election. Progress is what we need, because I think Brexit paralysis is slowly killing us all, and I think we need to move on, and I think that's how we will get public confidence.
On that, Faye, what happens if there's a no-deal Brexit in a couple of months' time? Or, you know,
I get that whole
time.
question, do I?
Yeah.
That whole thing.
But what happens to this debate? Does that kind of raise the prospect then of independence?
Yes. Yes. I mean, from an analytical point of view, yes. If we leave on WTO terms and the government does not put measures in place to support, say, our farming industry, which in Wales is probably the most heavily exposed sector. You know, I used to work for the National Farmers Union. I've worked in agriculture, and I know very clearly what could happen. And we've seen it in New Zealand when subsidies were withdrawn overnight. It decimated the farming industry, and I really do worry that no deal could do that again. You know, I think that is only going to add fuel to the independence question. So I think a good Brexit, a positive Brexit, whether that's on the 31st of October, which I highly doubt, I think a good Brexit it's got to be rewarding for all of us.
Sinead, I'm going to ask a really horrible question now. I'm so sorry. Is Plaid Cymru's hope that there is a no-deal Brexit because it will probably increase support for independence?
I think on a superficial level, yes, it will increase independence, but that is with lacking the nuance and the detail that goes behind that. You know, support might increase, but the technicalities of leaving England and the UK would become far, far more difficult if the whole of the UK was outside of Europe. You know, especially if Wales wanted to be a part of the EU, we'd find ourselves with a hard border against England, and I think that would become, you know, how do you make the case, you know, in the first place to the nation?
We just put all that signs on the bridge. They can afford it.
So I think it's very galvanising, and it's opening up the conversation, which is brilliant. But I wouldn't want the conversation to be misled in thinking that leaving the EU, especially without a deal, would help us gain independence. I don't think it will.
Can I go with the lady in the blue, actually, because we've only had one question from a woman so far. So
I just wanted to ask, regardless of what happens with Brexit, because at the moment, you know, none of us can predict that, looking towards your kind of federal ideas, do you think possibly Scotland has gone so far down the route of independence now that Scotland wouldn't be supporting any kind of federal UK? Because whether we think that might work for Wales, are Scotland going to think that works for Scotland? And are we going to go forward without them? I'm not sure how that would work.
Hugh, do you want to start with that one, actually?
Well, let's say, all hypothesis here, but let's say on the 31st we do go out, but we don't go out with a deal, a managed process. We variously termed crash out. I think in Scotland the read-through of that would be, let's have a referendum again. The once in a generation ceases to be once in a generation. It becomes, let's do it now. And it wouldn't just be because of Brexit, it's also divergence of value systems as well amongst the Scottish public from what they see happening in Westminster government as well. Now, that doesn't have a direct read across in Wales, but it does mean if there were... Now, this is all speculation, right? So don't anybody tweet out now, Hugh Rankin-Davies is saying Scotland goes independent. So it's all hypothesis. Do it now. Yeah. But if Scotland were to have a referendum, and that was to go, bearing in mind how tight it was last time, and bearing in mind that I suspect that some of the key actors who managed to dissuade some people from voting for independence last time up there, some very prominent statesman-like people entered the debate. They may not be doing it this time. Let's say it was lost. It doesn't have a direct read across in Wales, but suddenly you're left, if it was successful, with an England and Wales and whatever Northern Ireland is doing union, depending on what the shape of the hard crash-out Brexit is and what it does to Northern Ireland. That starts to look definitely imbalanced. So curiously, I would draw as my sage in this back to David Melding. because David Meldon has anticipated this in what he's right. David, I have a lot of time for. He is a clever, intelligent, thoughtful unionist, but he recognises there has to be change. And he has said this could be the break-in point if you follow through in this hypothesis. And what his appeal to colleagues here and in Westminster is, wake up and smell the coffee. Now then, does that mean we can't have Scotland on board? No, because there is an alternative hypothesis. And that alternative hypothesis is, somehow or other, there's either a slight kick into the long grass again as we try and work out what the hell we're going to do with the Northern Ireland border and etc. Or alternatively, there is some amazing managed deal that happens by October the 31st. So referendum call doesn't get any traction in Scotland, they're still there. Then this First Minister needs to be knocking on Nicola Sturgeon's door saying, we know your ultimate aim is independence, but for the good of all of our citizens, we need to be down there with Sadiq Khan, with Andy Burnham and everybody else knocking on the door saying, at least a step needs to be a much greater parity, and here's the things we need. We've already written it. We've written the blueprint in Wales. We've given it to the UK government. We were doing some of the discussions on it. So those are two totally different ones, and we just don't know. You're right. It's all up in the air at the moment.
We've only got 4 seconds left. I'm going to come very, very quickly to each of you with just one final word on what do you think the most likely outcome for the next 12 months is going to be in terms of this debate.
Well, I don't think we're going to make progress on independence in the next 12 months. Sorry, but and you know, to go back to the chattering classes, I think this is something that we talk about a lot and get obsessed with and really geek out over. But does everybody out there? Maybe not. Maybe they will quite soon. But I think we've got to get Brexit done, and then we're headlong into an assembly elections in 2021, and then we'll see.
I completely disagree that we won't make headway with the independence conversation. So recent polls say that if we were to leave, if we were given a referendum tomorrow about independence, 31% would vote to become an independent nation. Imagine what that percentage would be in a year. We've seen thousands of people march for independence in 3 spots across Wales so far, and there are more to come. So this is only going to gain momentum as Westminster sort of rolls in its calamity. So I think the arguments will solidify, the conversation will spread, and I hope will diversify. And I think it will become a more and more realistic prospect as time goes by, and hopefully that'll be enough to convince most of the nation to get a Plaid Cymru government in 2021.
Final word from you, if that's okay.
Okay.
A lot of pressure, sorry.
Thanks, yeah. I think Boris Johnson will try to break the law, quite simply. And I think that we will come incredibly close to a no-deal Brexit. I don't know whether or not it will happen. I'm going to jinx it now by saying I think it will happen, and I think there will be no deal. Then the timetable won't be up to Westminster, it will be set by Nicola Sturgeon. She will say, I'm going to do this in this time, and there's nothing you can do about it. That's it. I've had enough. And they will. And they, not necessarily within 12 months, but they will have set the timetable. And everybody else will play catch-up. Nicola Sturgeon will be the star of the next 12 months. Of that, I am certain.
And on that, is that optimistic? Is that doomsday? That's really good. On that note, we will finish. Thank you all very much for coming today, and I hope you can thank our panellists. I think it's been a really good meal.